Let's talk about dating the Torah. There are a number of problems that it comes to when dating the Torah. Question number 1, which part of the Torah are you dating? Are you trying to date the Garden of Eden? Would you try and date Noah's flood? How about the destruction of the Tower of Babel? So generally what historians and theologians do is they try to look to the Exodus. The Exodus is the most detailed, a large-scale historical event that we should be able to point to with some degree of certainty. If we can date the Exodus, we can probably date at least the time when the Torah was written, as the Torah would have likely been written around that time or shortly after. Point number 2, how you interpret the Torah is generally going to be dependent on your worldview. If you interpret the Torah as something very literal and you look at the ages of the people within the Torah and the dates that are given as the Torah as very literal dates and read them with a very Western historical understanding, you're going to come to a different conclusion than someone who says, well, let's understand those dates can sometimes be figurative, and if we look at the archaeological evidence, we get a bit of a different story. We'll look at this in greater detail later in the course. So let's propose 3 theories for the dating of the Torah. Weird as it might seem, dating the Exodus has actually proved to be kind of a controversial topic, but there are 3 major theories as to the dating of the Exodus. Theory number 1 puts the Exodus during the Middle Kingdom around the 1800 BC mark. This theory is become popularized through a very famous documentary called Patterns of Evidence. Patterns of Evidence was heavily based on the work of David Rohl, an Egyptologist who's quite controversial. While David Rohl would not propose to support the evidence for the Exodus on biblical grounds, he does so on archaeological grounds. David Rohl says if we look in the 1800s, we see a tremendous amount of evidence that suggests there was a Semitic community living in Egypt, then a catastrophic event within Egypt after which the Semitic community exits. The city of Avaris was settled by people from the Canaanite region around the 1800s, and then overnight it seems to have been suddenly abandoned for no apparent reason. In point number 2, David Rohl looks to the Ipuwer Papyrus. The Ipuwer Papyrus is kind of a catastrophic lament of dreadful events that were occurring within Egypt at that time. It speaks of rivers of blood, slaves escaping from households, and even says that there is no house which death had not touched. It seems to deeply mirror the 12 plagues that were written about within the Exodus account. The third piece of evidence would be the Brooklyn Papyrus. The Brooklyn Papyrus is actually a list of slaves living in Egypt at that time. What is particularly noteworthy about this papyrus is numerous names within this papyrus are Hebrew names. Of particular note is Shiphrah, which is a Hebrew name, and it's the same name given to the midwife in Exodus 1:15. Rohl notes that although the timelines don't match up with the biblical account, the archaeological evidence is so overwhelming that there was a Semitic community that lived through a disaster in Egypt and then leaves quite suddenly. It is worth noting that the overwhelming majority of Egyptologists and historians and Old Testament scholars reject Rohl's timeline. Theory number 2 proposes that the Exodus took place in 1446 BC. In Egyptian terms, this would be the early New Kingdom. This theory is dependent upon a very literal reading of other parts of the Bible.
1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord.
This theory comes out of doing a little Bible math. Since we know Solomon's temple was built around 996, all we need do is minus 480 from that timeline, which would bring us back to 1446 BC. While this theory seems to have biblical support, it does struggle from a lack of historical evidence, particularly considering what was happening in Egypt at that time. Theory number 3 is the Exodus took place during the late New Kingdom. This would have happened around 1270 BC, and this theory looks at the political situation within Egypt and Canaan at that time. Let's look at the evidence for the 1270 date. Point number 1, the cities of Python and Ramses are directly mentioned within the Exodus account, but those cities themselves did not exist within the 1440s BC, but did exist around 1270 BC. Point number 2, in the 1440s, the capital of Egypt where the Pharaoh lived was in Thebes. This would have been several days' journey from any potential Hebrew site site within Egypt at that time. As we do see Moses and the Pharaoh speaking to each other quite regular, it's difficult to say that they would have lived several days' journey apart. Yet we do see by 1270 the capital had moved to P. Ramses, and this would have been a mere few hours' walk from a very sizable site which probably had a Semitic population. The next historical fact which makes the 1440s date a little unlikely is that during this time Canaan was actually a colony of Egypt. All records show that the Egyptian army was very well and firmly established in Canaan around this time, and there doesn't seem to be much mention of them being there within the Old Testament accounts. Yet if we contrast this with the 1270, we actually see a radical transformation was happening in the world at that time. This event was called the Bronze Age collapse, which was one of the most monumental events to take place in all of human history. Overnight, the landscape of huge sections of society completely transformed. In the world at that time, there was a series of large empires like Babylonians, Assyrians, and Egyptians, and they were all independently trading with one another in relative harmony. But then came a series of land strikes, there was trade wars, and then rose up a group of sea people that started to terrorize all of these different communities at various times. This happened to be in conjunction with all of these states being in somewhat of a weakened state due to trade wars. Empires like the Hittites were completely destroyed during this time, whereas groups like the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Assyrians were left in a far weakened state. Due to other major empires being in such a weakened state, other smaller groups like Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites start to come on the scene at this time. After such a catastrophic event with so many weakened empires, it would have been very easy for a small group like the Hebrews to develop their own nation at this time. After the Bronze Age collapsed, the world lay in ruins. Great cities were reduced to rubble. Libraries were in ashes, and so much of the incredible written historical record which would have clarified so many things about the ancient world was forever gone. Much of what we could have known about Moses and the Exodus would have been turned into ash during this time. The Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world changed from an empire of plenty to a place of struggle and starvation. We also see at this time that the population of Canaan goes through a pretty radical decline and then has a sudden spike where a bunch of new settlements develop in the 1200s. But let's re-examine that date in 1 Kings 6:1. If we take the dates as literal, we come very solidly to our 1440s date.
1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord.
But what if the numbers, as they so often are in the scriptures, were actually symbolic? We all know the number 12 represents God's chosen people, and as there were 12 tribes of Israel, this would have made perfect sense. The biblical number 40 is often the number for a trial in the wilderness. This is symbolized by Christ fasting for 40 days and water pouring down on Noah for 40 days. So if we times 40 by 12, we come to this number for 480. This could be a literal number representing an exact 480 years, or this could be a metaphorical number representing the time God's chosen people, the 12, went through a period of testing in the wilderness represented by 40 years. All that to say, the dating of the Torah is very complicated indeed. What's the right answer? You decide.